Now, everybody has a worldview. And the reason why you find that hard to believe is because not everybody you know talks about the things I just talked about. Not everybody you know talks about the nature of knowledge and the limits of possibility and how we should live our lives. In fact, you might think it rather strange if your next door neighbor started talking that way. So, whoa, you really entered into a different world. You're not yourself today, Ben. What's going on? Not everyone talks about philosophy. That's true. But everybody does philosophy. Not everybody talks about it, and not everybody thinks about it self-consciously, but everybody does it. Okay, so you say, Dr. Bahnsen, I'm sorry, that's just not true. My next door neighbor, he says, hey, you only go around once in life, grab for all the gusto you can get. That's his life. That's it right there. And I want to tell you, that is a worldview. It may not be expressed in an academic way. It may not sound real scholarly. It may not be sophisticated. It may not be defensible, but that is a worldview. Let's stop and look at that. You only go around once in life, so grab for all the gusto you can get. What does it mean you only go around once in life? There's no life after death, right? There is no spiritual domain. That probably means there is no God as well. But nevertheless, you only go around once in life is a statement about the nature of reality and the meaning of human life. And notice that there's an ethical position attached to it. So grab for all the gusto you can get. How should you live your life? For pleasure. Now, if you were at the local university, we have a name for that. We call that hedonism. In fact, we can get real technical about that. We can distinguish between quantitative and qualitative hedonism. You have the hedonism of Aristippus and the hedonism of Epicurus. And your neighbor happens to follow the school of Aristippus rather than Epicurus. You think he's going to be fascinated by that? He doesn't care. Just give him his beer. That's all he wants. But the point is, his grabbing for the beer is a statement of his philosophy. He says, grab for all the gusto you can get. It's not important to him the quality of pleasure. It's just how much pleasure you can get. Build up those pleasure points. That's what life is all about. So you see what I'm getting at? When I tell you that unbelievers are walking worldviews, that everybody's got a worldview, I don't mean everybody's a scholar. I don't mean everybody talks philosophically, but I'm saying everybody's got philosophical convictions. Everybody. Everybody has some elementary conviction about what is real. You know, you tell your neighbor that you saw a ghost, and your neighbor might say, hey, that's real. If you can't touch it, it's not real. Okay, that's not a sophisticated philosophical position, not well worked out and so forth, but it's a view of what is possible. Neighbor says, hey, ghosts aren't possible. And other people think that they are. I mean, you have people who read, the astrological forecast and so forth, and they've got some conviction about this being a magical universe that mysteriously controls our destinies and so forth. Everybody's got a view of reality. Everybody's got a view of human life, what it's all about. Where does man fit into the universe? Is there life after death? How should we live with one another? What's right? What's wrong? Everybody's got such a worldview. And the nature of the case, then, when you defend the faith, what you want to do is to set the Christian worldview over against the non-Christian's worldview, and your aim is to show that the non-Christian's worldview cannot make sense out of life at all. Indeed, the non-Christian's worldview cannot even make sense out of the criticism that the non-Christian is directed at you. Okay? Unbelievers are walking worldviews, and now what you want to do is make sure that your defending the faith gets around to comparing the worldview of the unbeliever to the worldview of the Christian. I do not mean to suggest that's the first thing you talk about. I do not mean to suggest that that is the first that you talk about that maybe in your first discussion even. You may have to take some time just clearing away a lot of intellectual debris or answering, petty questions that the unbeliever has. But along the way, what you have to eventually get to is what's really at stake, and that's the underlying worldview with which this person approaches the faith and the underlying worldview that you are defending as a Christian. The Bible teaches us that there is, in principle, an unresolved antithesis between the way unbelievers think and the way believers think. There is a clash between our worldviews and our commitments and our lifestyles. The mind of the sinful nature is at enmity with God, for it is not subject to the law of God, nor can it be. That's what Paul says in Romans 8, verse 7. The mind of the sinful nature, the mind of the flesh, the unregenerate man's way of thinking is at enmity with God. Take that seriously. The problem with your unbelieving friend is not that he or she lacks information. Don't think that, you see, they really would like to find God. They'd like to become Christians. If we could just give them enough information, then they'd finally convert. That isn't what the Bible tells you. You need to understand your opponent better than that. The Bible says the unregenerate person's mind is an enemy of God. And it's not just that your unbelieving friend has failed to subject himself or herself to the law of God. Your unbelieving friend cannot subject himself or herself to the law of God, cannot think God's thoughts after him, cannot obey what God requires. In Ephesians 4, verses 17 to 19, Paul's description of the unbelieving mind is graphic. Paul needed a real lesson on how to talk to people and not be offensive, because here he describes the unbeliever, and he doesn't hold back at all. He says unbelievers walk in the vanity of their minds. They walk with darkened understanding. They are guilty of ignorance and hardened hearts. Or if you want it in a real simple expression, Romans 1:22 says, professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. In a nutshell, that's what it's all about. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. The unbeliever thinks he's so smart, he's so self-sufficient, he's got it wired. He understands what truth is. He knows the nature of reality. He knows how he should be living his life. He professes to be wise, but the Bible says he becomes a fool. There is an antithesis, a fundamental, principial clash between the way Christians think and the way non-Christians think. And the Bible says the way non-Christians think reduces to foolishness, to absurdity. We don't really share a worldview with unbelievers, though unbelievers are inconsistent. We'll talk about that tomorrow especially. For what they say with their mouths, there is no agreement between the unbeliever and the believer. Remember how Pilate arrogantly asked, what is truth, when the truth was standing right in front of him? Agrippa differed with Paul over what is believable or possible. Paul said, look, the resurrection of Jesus was not done in a corner. Why do you think that this is not believable or possible? In 1 Timothy 6:20, Paul tells us that what unbelievers call knowledge, believers call pseudo-knowledge. And in 1 Corinthians 1, verses 18 to 25, Paul goes on and on about how what believers call wisdom, unbelievers call foolishness. And what unbelievers call wisdom, we call foolish. There is a fundamental clash between the underlying philosophy of the believer and the unbeliever. And on top of that, the Bible assures you the unbeliever's philosophy, whatever its brand, whatever its stripe, the unbeliever's philosophy reduces to absurdity, to foolishness.